And then it also involves addressing Iran's destabilizing behavior in the region, where Iran has really weakened governments, has tried to create conditions where governments in the region are dependent on Iran for support. This is sort of the Hezbollah model. While they grow militias outside of the government's control that can be turned against that government if it acts against Iranian interests. And so this is really the driver of this conflict, or the interaction between these jihadist terrorist organizations and Iranian-supported militias and terrorists.
Do you think that, toppling or removing ISIS or Daesh from a place like Mosul has further empowered, emboldened these Shia militias that are backed and funded by Iran?
Well, Iran has engaged in a very sophisticated campaign of political subversion, in not only in Iraq, but broadly throughout the region. And you see what they've been doing in Yemen, which is terribly destructive as well. And they've been building this network across the region of proxy forces and militias and terrorist organizations, and they've weaponized that network in a way that threatens our partners in the Gulf region and threatens Israel as well. And so it's very important, I think, for us to take a holistic view of what Iran is doing. We ought to pull the curtain back on the behavior and actions of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, and then all of us need to work together to sanction that organization, to dry up its funding, and to impose some costs on Iran for their destabilizing behavior.
Do you see Saudi Arabia as a destabilizing force in the region as well?
Saudi Arabia, we think, is becoming an even more and more important partner in the region. And there have been some very positive developments in Saudi Arabia, as you know, with calls for reform. The Crown Prince's speech recently, I think, was very strong on this point. The President traveled to Riyadh, as you know, very early in his presidency, and he addressed really an unprecedented group of over 50 Muslim majorities. And we're building, I think, amazing consensus across all of those countries and across the world on what we must do to remove this scourge of terrorism from the earth, and to make sure that our children don't have to live in fear anywhere.
What about actions in Yemen then? Saudi's actions in Yemen. We're talking about blockades, we're talking about airstrikes, 10,000 people dead, famine, cholera.
Well, what you have to also look at is the actions of the Iranians and the Houthi militias that they're supporting. And whereas Saudi Arabia in the last week, and all of us need to do more to address this humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen, and Saudi Arabia's done that this past week. They're lifting the blockade, trying to get more humanitarian assistance in. But the problem is, once it lands in southern Yemen in particular, how does it get to the point of need? And that's the areas that these Houthi militias control. So all parties need to do everything possible to alleviate human suffering and to prevent what could be an even worse catastrophe in Yemen. In particular, food and medical supplies need to get through, but also fuel, because it's the fuel that's needed to access clean water.
So are you calling on Saudi Arabia to lift these blockades?
Oh, we have called on Saudi Arabia to do everything they can to alleviate this humanitarian crisis. The President put out a strong series of statements, 2 statements last week on this, and it's a grave concern to all of us. It has to be a grave concern for the world, and as you know, the United States and many of our allies and partners are lead donors to provide humanitarian assistance. But even the funding that we have available, it doesn't do any good if we can't get the supplies that the people need to the point.